Puts us right there.
All right. Ambiguous grief. We okay, so this is talking about losses that we don't have any closure with. So if we were let's just talk about Harvey. There was no closure really with Harvey, right?
Right.
Even when we got back in our houses, we still were dealing with the loss of our house. So I noticed the other day that yesterday that Rhonda and Phil were having champagne to celebrate the anniversary of when they moved back in their house. But that's awesome because they've moved forward in their new house, but they had to grieve that loss of their house before they could get to that place. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And then we talked about infertility and terminating pregnancies, Alzheimer's and dementia. Alzheimer's, I think, is the worst because you are dealing with those bits and pieces. And it's not like you can have a funeral for every bits and piece that you lose. But as you move forward, you get to a point where the person may or may not know their spouse. They may or may not know their children. And so the love is still there, but the person that they knew is not. And many of you in this group have experienced that. So if you want to say anything about that, I think that would be lovely.
Well, you lose their personalities too. And sometimes somebody that was very soft-spoken and kind is loud and angry. And it's hard to accept that and understand it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
expanding on what Jan says, they're still there more or less physically, but they become a different person. And it's hard to reconcile that with who they were before.
Yeah. So you can see how people kind of get stuck in, what do I do? Yes, this is my parent, or yes, this is my child, but this is not the person they were. That's why the grief process is frozen. I think that's such an apt phrase that's used. Anybody else want to say anything about this?
No.
Okay, can everybody read these?
Yes.
Okay, so we were talking about the loss, the two types, physical or psychological. And psychological might mean, okay, I had this child and they were the most fun and we used to do all this stuff, and then all of a sudden when they turned 13, they had some kind of mental break, and now this is the child, right? Or at 15 they decided to run away and they're no longer there. So physically they're not there, but you haven't had a funeral for them because you don't know whether they're dead or whether they're alive. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Am I still married to my missing spouse? We talked about the fact that when people are missing in action, it makes it really tough on the families at home. The parents, do I still have a child? The spouse, do I still have a husband, or do I still have a wife? Children, I was listening to the news not too long ago, and there were some families whose father, now these were people in their 80s, I think. Their father's bones were recovered either from Korea, or I think it was from Korea. And they never knew what happened to their dad. They never knew. But, you know, the thing is, when they got this, you would think after that long, they would have been like, oh, okay. But they were in tears because they got back what they had lost. They could actually say, okay, now we know what happened. Now we can say my dad died.
Yeah.
So it makes it really hard. The overall goal of therapy to cope with ambiguous loss is to overcome the trauma associated with it and restoring resilience. You know, if we had to apply a word to Jan, resilience would probably be that word, right? So there are other people that we know that we look at the losses that they've had and we say, how are you still standing upright? How are you still moving forward? And that's this resilience that they're talking about here. So for some people, that resilience is about faith. For other people, that resilience is about family. For other people, the resilience is just that inside part of them that says you can't stop, you have to keep moving forward.
I like to call it grace.
Well, that's true. In spiritual circles, that's exactly what it would be called, Jan. This resilience is what you're shooting for. Just being able to put one foot in front of the other, being able to keep moving forward. Questions on any of these? And I can't see everybody, so y'all will have to shout out if you want to say anything. All right. So this is the model that this Caudle and Sarazan put together, and they have a really good article. They talk about these events: divorce, discovery, diagnosis, and death of a relationship. And feeling the state of grief, and we all know, because just about everybody in this group has been through grief, right?
Yes.
And so for everybody, it is different. We all process, go through, deal with grief in only the way that we can deal with grief, right? That's why it looks so different for everybody. But in general, everyone, no matter how they deal with it, will go through that 5-stage process, you know, bargaining and denial and anger, and then you get to acceptance. But you may not have that in this ambiguous grief. You're going to have some of that, but it would be like, y'all remember when that young girl went missing off Tiki Island? And they searched for her for months and months and months. In fact, one of their good friends I worked with at Horace Mann. And they worked for months and months and months, and they never could find her, and they haven't found her to this day. And I think of her when I think of ambiguous grief, because what do you do with any of those? You can bargain, you know what, God, just let us find her. You know, if she's dead, okay, but let us find her. Anger, who are you going to be angry at? You don't know what happened to her. You don't know where she is. You don't know if she's alive or if she's dead. So where do you put that anger? Yeah. And then how do you get to acceptance if you never find her? So when I think of ambiguous grief, many times I think of her, and I've thought of her over the years because they looked for so long for her. And that was an only child, and I can't imagine her parents. Hope presents because there's no physical death. So do those parents of that girl, do they probably still have hope that maybe she's alive somewhere and she just can't get back to them?
I would think so.
That would be the only way that I would think they could move forward. So if somebody's missing and you can't find them, you can always have that hope that they're still alive.
Yeah.
Right?
But Mickey, and maybe it's just me, but in that situation, I would almost hope that she was not still alive if she was in a situation where she was being abused or whatever. So it's ambiguous what you even hope for.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword for sure. I just don't know. And that's only one of a bajillion kinds of ambiguous grief. That's just the one that I think of. And you're right. It's just a very difficult place to be. That's why you can get stuck. That's why they call it frozen grief. And then at the end, you have, two paths that can intersect in their own, going back and forth. So on the one hand, you can have internal hope and self-focus, a future of recovery. On the other hand, you have the external hope and focus on the past and on others. And there's probably going to be some complicated grief when that's the direction that you're in. Does this model make sense to people?
Yes.
Yeah.
Anybody have any questions? Comments?
Well, I think what it says there is two possible paths that can intersect in their own cycle at varying times.
Mhm.
And that is certainly true. And, that to me, that would be what you would have to go through, because you wouldn't want to stay in external hope all the time because you'd be crushed. You wouldn't be able to move.
Right. But Marcia, some people do stay there, and that's where that complicated grief is. And it is difficult to get out of that place. But what they're saying here also is that you can go back and forth in those.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would give you
Yeah.
some hope, some, I don't.
Yeah, I
You
agree.
wouldn't.
I think it would be awfully difficult with ambiguous grief to be hopeful all the time. I think there would be times where you're like, oh yeah, no, I need it to be like it was. I need to go backwards, not forwards. So, anything else on this model? So Stephanie Sarrazin, which is the lady with that model, while grief is universal, it's not something we like to discuss at a Friday night dinner party. I like that part. Second only to shame, grief is the least researched human emotion, which is surprising considering it's also identified as a universal experience found in both humans and animals. And it seems to me to be, I have a hard time believing it's the least researched because I read about it all the time. And maybe that's just what I read, but I was surprised to learn it's the least researched. Do y'all agree with this? We very rarely go to a Friday night dinner party and discuss grief or,
Or death.
people kind of
Not
walk
at a
away
party.
from you. Do what?
Not at a party.
No. Not at a lot of things. You'll find that people will say, how are you? Because they expect you to say fine, right? They don't ask, how are you? Because they're expecting you to say, you know what? I just don't know what to do right now because I'm just really sad about what's going on and I don't know how to move forward. If you said that to somebody, they would be like, okay, good to see you.
Bye.
Yeah.
They would be moving on.
Well, it depends who you say it to.
Yeah.
That's
Sometimes it's just a polite thing to say.
Okay, these are some symptoms which I thought was interesting. You know, when people are grieving, there's a certain look that they have. You know, you kind of understand. But when it's ambiguous grief, there's not always those same kind of looks or symptoms. So they talk in this first part about the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. I don't think in ambiguous grief you get to the acceptance part. So you can get stuck in any one of those phases. And I think it's easy to see how you could get stuck. And this is putting you at a higher risk for depression or anxiety. Feelings of self-recrimination, especially if it's something like a child that's missing or something like that. It can freeze you in that process because you just try to figure out, you know, what could I have done differently? How can I change what the reality is? It's also common for sufferers to show a high level of agitation, both physically and mentally. When people are suffering with grief, period, but especially with ambiguous grief, their mind is going all the time, but they're not focused. And so that agitation is always there. Your mind tries to reconcile the cognitive dissonance, and you may find yourself feeling restless, unable to sit still, and unable to focus on daily activities. Or you might ruminate constantly over questions and worries. So let's just say, let's say I had a miscarriage, for instance. Maybe instead of being able to move forward, maybe I'm sitting at my dining room table trying to figure out, what did I do to cause this miscarriage? What could I have done differently? What can I do differently next time? And maybe that's maybe that's playing on a loop in my mind all the time because I'm stuck there trying to figure out, if I only knew what I did wrong, if I only knew what I could change, then next time will be different. You see how that works?
Mhm.
That little tape recorder that gets stuck in your head.
Yeah, yeah. And because this type of grief often comes with increased levels of stress, you might experience physical symptoms of prolonged stress. And some of us had these things going on during Harvey because we were stressed 24/7. So stomach problems, chronic pain, headaches, over or under eating. So I have a tendency to just stop eating when I'm stressed. James has a tendency to eat everything when he's stressed. No, so it's one or the other, either overeat or undereat. An increase in addictive behaviors if you have a problem with alcohol or drugs, not being able to sleep. Those are just some of the symptoms. And we see it when things happen that we cannot explain. We have no beginning and end. We have no rhyme or reason. And we don't like that. We want to be able to explain everything. And that's not how life works. I don't know why we think it works that way, but that's not how it works. Questions on any of these or comments?
Just a short one. I couldn't read a book, and I was a constant reader prior to Thomas and Beth's death. And I can finally say this past 2 weeks, I can read a book again. But it's taken that long to be able to stay quiet enough to focus. And that was a residual left over from the grieving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's not unusual at all. I'm glad you can read again. Anybody else have anything they want to say about these? Okay. probably the most important part of this whole thing. Ambiguous grievers can heal, but you have to identify, acknowledge, and name the grief.
Amen.
And that starts by boldly, unabashedly standing in our own truth. So if I never acknowledge that my son is an addict living on the streets, how in the world could I possibly get through that grief? My husband lived a double life through most of our marriage. My mother suffers from dementia and doesn't remember me. You know, I think people sometimes feel when they say things like this with dementia, that it's someone complaining about their mom instead of understanding that they're grieving the loss of their mom along the way. I've been rejected by my parents because of who I am. A lot of times that's because of divorce. A lot of times that's because of being gay. A lot of times that's because the parents just are not wanting that child to be who they are, because that's not what the parents planned. The house I raised my children in has been torn apart by flood, tornado, fire. Our homes are these places that people come and go, oh yeah, I remember this. Well, when something happens to that home, it's like, oh no, my kids can't come back to that home anymore. What does that mean? How am I gonna, what do I do with that? And it seems like a small thing, but it's just not. We have so many people who get divorced these days that doesn't seem like a big thing. But most of us don't get married thinking, hey, I think in 5 years I'll get divorced and marry somebody else. When we get married, we think we're getting married forever. And when that doesn't happen, there's a lot of grief with that. Even if it was a bad marriage, there's just a lot of grief. What else can we add to this list? Who has something else who can add to this list?
Well, in divorce, it's not just, it's like a death, it's the end of something, but you also, on top of it, deal with rejection.
Mm-hmm.
Or feeling rejected and failure.
Yep.
Well, like in divorce, you may lose relationships with the divorced spouse and the divorced spouse's family that were very important to you.
Yep.
So, I mean, and then
Or churches, church families, when people get divorced, one person stays at the church, the other person goes somewhere else.
you know, our congregation has been pretty good at giving space to both spouses to stay in the church, even though what you said is true most cases.
Mm-hmm. So what about with this pandemic for the last year and few months? What losses are there?
Way of life.
The way of life, yeah. That's hard to put into words, isn't it?
Yeah, that's kind of broad, but
Well, no closure with the dying relative, the dying person.
Yeah.
You weren't allowed to be with them,
Oh.
you know, in their last breaths.
Yeah. What else?
No fellowship with your larger family.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yes.
John asks me every Sunday when he calls me about the apple of my eye, my grandson. Well, you know, I saw him at his door on April 4th for his birthday. I saw him at his door for Christmas. That's been it.
Yeah.
And that hurts my heart. And he's not the only one. I mean, that's just normal. You couldn't be around people.
Yeah. But that was hard, wasn't it?
It's very.
Yeah. Yeah. You miss that closeness.
Yeah.
It's for those of us who are immunocompromised, we're not sure whether it's over or not, you know, like we go, wow, we could go to church this Sunday, but should we be? We don't even really know yet, you know, because all of the immunocompromised people were left out of the clinical trials. So they tell us to get vaccinated and act like we're not. So it's like
Yeah.
really, you feel like you're in limbo.
Yeah.
Well,
And,
also
and
too,
that's grief. It's like I can't live my life, and what do I do with that?
I personally managed the year better than I am managing the last 3 or 4 months. And I'm vaccinated, but it's like I'm having a problem getting back to what was normal in every sense. I mean,
Mhm.
does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
I would say, ambiguous grievers are the caregivers, the health caregivers. Here they are trained to help people heal, and yet they were very helpless for a lot of people with COVID. They were dying. They didn't get a chance to get space. They were just one after another,
Mhm.
during the height of the pandemic. And there may be another wave coming up with this COVID D.
And I pretty much
These
guarantee you those healthcare workers who are not talking about all of that, there will be more suicides. We had some suicides early on, but there will be more as we come to the end, whatever the end looks like. That's why, see this part? We must identify, acknowledge, and name the grief. We don't want to do that. I don't know when we started thinking that speaking truth was weakness, but if we don't name what we're grieving, it just sits like a lump in our chest. And it's not healthy.
And it's against scripture. It says, you shall know the truth and you shall be free.
Mhm.
So this part especially, some of you may have heard of Krista Tippett, but this is Pauline Boss is the one that came up with the myth of closure. And this is Living the Questions. Did y'all ever do any of the Bible studies, Living the Questions?
Uh-huh.
Well, you can click on this and listen to this, but it's just about exactly what we've been talking about with the COVID-19. So I think it's worth reading or listening to. You can listen to it and you can also read it. So I'm going to leave that up there. It says Boss coined the term ambiguous loss, which refers to experiencing loss in which death cannot be verified or not being able to guarantee that a person will return to their former condition. So, a lot of the people who had COVID still have health problems. So even though they were able to get well, they still have some major health problems with their lungs or with there's a couple of different areas that they're finding out that this is long term. So the ambiguous grief associated with COVID-19 is not over. And we need to pay attention to it. We need to be talking about it.
Right.
Another form of ambiguous grief is when you get a chronic illness
Yes.
and know that you'll never return to a state of health that you had before the illness set in.
Yeah. Exactly. Does anybody need me to leave this up longer?
Got it.
All right. So I'm going to stop this share. And I'm going to